Welcome back to, I think we're on part 4 of the story of Edgar Sawtelle. I hope you are loving this book as much as I love it. I look so forward to coming and reading the next section. In fact, I just want to take the book home and just finish it and then come back and finish it again. And when you find a book like that, you know it's one that is going to be powerful to share with others. So let's get into the next chapter. It's called The Litter. He woke that day to an empty bedroom and the distant recollection of Almondine jumping off the bed in the gray morning light. He'd meant to follow her, but then he lay back, and when he opened his eyes again, the sun was bright and the curtains billowing inward, carrying with them a volley of echo-doubled hammer strikes. Claude at work on the field side of the barn roof. He kicked off the covers and dressed and descended the stairs, sneakers in hand. Almondine lay sprawled in a parallelogram of sunlight on the porch. His father and mother were at the kitchen table sharing pages from the Mellon Weekly Record. Morning chores had been done, and the 2 kennel dogs, brought to the house on the nightly rotation, were back in their runs. Edgar ate toast on the porch, looking out at the field. Almondine rolled onto her back, splayed and crocodilian, and stared at his plate. He looked down at her and grinned. "Too bad," he signed, munching. Almondine swabbed her tongue across her chops and swallowed. "Edgar, when is school over?" his father called from the kitchen. Edgar inspected the remaining square inch of his toast, butter on the edges, the top heaped with red raspberry jam. He nibbled from the crust and smacked his lips. Almondine flexed on her backbone to get a better look. And finally, he held the toast out, pinched between thumb and forefinger, so her whiskers would brush his palm, an ancient habit. She scrambled to her feet, sniffing his offering, pretending to be unsure whether it would suit her, then lifted the toast daintily away with her small front teeth. Edgar walked into the kitchen and set his plate on the table. "Friday's the last day," he signed. "I checked Iris this morning. She's carrying her pups pretty low," his father said. Edgar looked at his father, looking solemnly back at him. Was there a problem? Was this too early for Iris? He tried to remember if he had groomed her the day before, or even touched her. "What would you think of making this litter yours?" It took a second to register what his father was saying. He blinked and looked out at the barn. I'm so sorry, my nose just runs. He looked out at the barn. The lines in the red siding pulsed through a wave in the porch window glass. "You'd do the birth work. I'd be there, but it would be your responsibility. And you'd look after the pups," his father said. "Every day, even if any gets sick, you'd take care of them no matter what else you'd rather do. And you'd be training right up to placement, even when school starts." Edgar nodded. He was smiling stupidly, but he couldn't stop. "With my help," his mother said, "if you want." She laughed a little and touched his arm and sat back. His father held the newspaper folded in his lap, and they looked so satisfied just then, and suddenly he knew they'd been discussing this for a long time. Watching him, trying to gauge whose litter would be best. He hadn't asked for any such thing. Ordinarily, his father oversaw the whelping. When the pups were old enough, they became his mother's charges. While she trained them, his father arranged placements. Edgar already had endless chores around the kennel, divided between the 2 of them. He fed and watered the dogs, cleaned their pens and groomed them, his specialty. He helped with training, too, crazy walking the pups, performing the short gaze exercise, creating distractions when his mother wanted to proof the dogs. But this was different. They wanted Edgar to handle a single litter from birth through placement. "With a little luck, she'll hold off whelping until school is out," his father said. "We have to keep an eye on her, though. You never know." He picked up his paper and folded it in the middle, then glanced over. "You look like you're about to have puppies," he said. Then Edgar started laughing. Almondine came in from the porch to see what was happening. Fanning her tail and holding her ears flat, she walked around the table, pressing her nose into their hands. "Thank you," Edgar sighed. He dropped his hands and lifted them again and put them down when he couldn't think of anything else to say. He went to the refrigerator and poured milk into his glass and drank it with the door open. From the back of the refrigerator, he retrieved a package of cheese curds. He ate one in plain sight, palmed the rest, and walked out into the brilliant summer daylight. The whelping room, set near the back of the barn and enclosed by thick plank walls, was a warmer, darker, quieter place than any other in the kennel. The wood of the walls reeked with birth odors: blood, placenta, milk, sweat. The pens were half-sized, with no outside access, to keep the temperature steady. His father had to stoop under the dropped ceiling. Low wattage bulbs cast a pale light that made Puppy's eyes glimmer, and an old-time wall thermometer hung in each pen. One backed by a Pepsi bottle, another a blue and white Valvoline label, both marked with a thick black line at 80 degrees. In the passageway, a battery wall clock with a sweep second hand ticked away quietly. A mother and her month-old litter occupied the first pen, the pups just old enough to escape the whelping box. They tumbled over one another and pressed their blunt black muzzles through the wire and nibbled Edgar's fingers, and then, for no reason he could see, spooked and scrambled away. In the farthest pen, Iris lay quietly panting, her back to the whelping box in the corner. He knelt beside her while her tongue stroked the back of his wrist. He placed one hand on the hot crepe of her belly, and in the other a cheese curd appeared. Iris tongued it off his palm. She sniffed her belly where he had touched her. "You're going to have to work real hard soon," he signed. "You know that, don't you?" Iris swallowed and looked at him, eyes wet in the cave light. He reached into his pocket and held out another curd. He dreamed he was running, feet pounding beneath him, breath coming in gasps. Always he arrived too late. The third night he woke in a fit of anxiety, and he was at the kitchen door, on his way to check Iris, before he decided it was a bad idea. At breakfast he peeled an egg, and he and his father walked to the barn. He rehearsed in his mind the case for skipping school, but before his father even touched Iris, he said, "It won't be today." Edgar squatted and stroked her face and broke the egg into pieces and fed it to her while his father tried to explain how he knew. "Look at her eyes," he said. "Are they teary? Is she walking in circles?" He felt the curve of Iris's huge belly. Her hindquarters, looked at her gums, took her temperature. He always had an explanation, but the truth, Edgar suspected, was that his father just knew. They didn't know how he knew. They looked up Iris's birthing history. She'd whelped on her 62nd day with her first litter of 6, and at 64 days with her second litter of 5. Friday would be day 62. When they were finished, Edgar collared Iris and snapped on a lead and let her walk wherever she liked. She headed for the tall grass behind the barn and then the Wolf River apple trees at the top of the orchard. Her hind legs rode out to her sides when she walked. When Almondine approached, serious and respectful, Iris stood for inspection. Edgar boarded the school bus in despair. 10,000 hours later, it ground to a halt in front of their driveway. He felt weightless as he opened the whelping room door. Iris lay sleeping, solitary, enormous. When Friday passed, he barely noticed that school was over. It was just another day when Iris would surely whelp while he was away. When he looked in on Saturday morning, the bedding in the whelping box had been scratched up into a pile. Instead of lying outstretched in her usual gestative pose, Iris was pacing and panting. She came forward with her ponderous gait. Once outside, she forged into the hayfield, aiming for the hazel stand. "That sounds interesting," his father said noncommittally when Edgar found him in the workshop. They walked to the nursery. Iris had settled herself back in the whelping box. "How's it going, girl? Today's the day." She looked back and bumped her tail against the slats. His father put his hands in his pockets and leaned against the wall and watched her. "Not right this minute," he said after a while, "but it's going to be sometime today. I want you to check her every half hour from now on, but stay out of the pen. We just want to know if she's sleeping, walking, or what." "I'll stay and wait." "No, don't spend any more time here than you have to. When you come in, be quiet and slow. She's worried now, and she's wondering how to protect her babies. If we bother her too much, she could panic. Understand? She could try to eat her puppies to keep them safe." "Okay," he signed. It wasn't what he wanted to hear, though he understood the reasoning. The next thing to watch for is when she starts licking herself or walking around the whelping box. Once that starts, we've got work to do. Now time thickened like wet cement. From his dresser, he dug out a pocket watch he'd gotten for Christmas many years before, and wound it and set it and shook it to make sure it was running. He and Almondine walked the path to the creek, but before they'd gone more than halfway, he turned and ran back, slapping through the ferns. They'd arrived 5 minutes early for the next check. He sat with his back against the narrow front wheels of the tractor while Almondine dozed, annoyingly relaxed, in the cool grass. When the time had passed, he found Iris lying in her box, muzzle atop folded forelegs. She caught his eye and raised her head. In the other whelping pen, a litter charged the door and tried to bite through the rubber toe of his sneaker when he pressed it to the wire. He went to the house, looked at the watch, compared it with the time on the kitchen clock. He fetched the New Webster Encyclopedia Dictionary of the English Language and opened it at random. His eyes jittered over the words. Intake, intangible, intarsia. He flipped a hunk of pages. Perilous, perimeter, paramorph. Ridiculous, impossible names for dogs. His toes twitched. His heels rattled against the floor. He slapped the dictionary shut and knelt in front of the television, twisting the channel knob to Wausau, Eclair, Ashland. His father parceled out small jobs, concocting them, Edgar suspected, more out of mercy than necessity. Pile newspapers outside the pen door, lay towels on the newspapers, straighten the bedding in the whelping box, wash the steel pan in the workshop, fill it with water, and put it on the stove. Put scissors and hemostat in the pan and boil the water. Put a bottle of Physohex on the towels. Set out thread and iodine. Get a short lead. After dinner, when the next half hour had passed, he excused himself and walked to the barn. They always seemed to start at dinner time, his father had said, and the dogs were standing in their pens, muzzles slowly turning to track his progress down the aisle. All it took was one glance. For fear of making a commotion, he forced himself to walk the whole length of the barn. But as soon as the evening sky opened overhead, his legs made the decision on their own, and he bolted for the house. Remember what I said about getting her nervous? She'll be calm if she knows we're calm, so move slow. She's an old hand at this. Our job is to watch and help just a little. That's all. Iris is going to be doing all the work. We're just keeping her company. Edgar was waddling along behind his father, a basin of warm water sloshing in his arms. Okay, he nodded. He took a breath, let it out. The sunset had cast his father's shadow back along the driveway. Now, Garth said, let's find out how she's doing. Iris stood in her whelping box, head down, digging frantically. She paused briefly when they entered the whelping room, glanced at them, then turned back to her work. Go ahead, his father said, gesturing at the door. Edgar stepped inside the pen, carrying the pan, and set it down in the corner. His father handed him the newspapers, the towels, all the paraphernalia he had collected during the afternoon. Iris stopped digging and walked to the door. His father squatted down and stroked her face and chest. He ran the tip of his finger along her gum line and put his palm against her swollen belly. In return, she pressed forward until one of her feet was outside the threshold of the pen. His father placed his hands on her shoulders and eased her back. He had Edgar latch the hook and eye on the inside of the door, and Iris returned to the whelping box and lay down. Now what? Edgar sighed. Now we wait. After 20 minutes or so, Iris stood and circled inside the whelping box. She whined and panted, then sat. And after a few more minutes, she stood again. She shivered, turned her head all the way back to her hindquarters, and licked at her hip. She shivered again. Shouldn't she be lying down? Edgar signed. Sit tight, his father said. She's doing just fine. Iris lowered herself nearly to the floor, hips suspended above the bedding. A spasm shook her body. She whined quietly, grunted, then raised her hips and turned to look behind her. A newborn pup, dark and shiny in its embryonic sac, lay on the gray bedding. Wash your hands, his father said. He closed his eyes and tipped his head back against the wall. Use the Physohex. As Edgar rubbed his hands together in the water, he heard a squeak from the whelping box. Iris had already torn the birth membrane away and had turned the new pup on its back. She was running her tongue along its head, then its belly and hind legs. Its fur glistened, and it kicked its hind legs and squeaked again. Has she chewed through the cord? His father asked. Edgar nodded. Wet one of the small towels and take a dry one and a couple of sheets of newspaper. Kneel over to the whelping box. Go slow. Use the wet towel to clean off the pup. Hold it right near Iris so she can see what you're doing. That's right. She's just checking you. It's okay if the pup cries a little. Make sure its nose and mouth are clear. Hold it in your left hand and get the dry towel with your other hand and dry it off. You can rub a little. Go ahead. That's good. You want to dry it off as much as you can. Now set it down in front of her. Edgar performed each step as instructed. His father sat with his back against the wall, eyes closed, his voice quiet and even, as if describing a dream in which the pups were born. When Edgar set the pup down, Iris began to lick it again. Edgar took a deep breath and listened to his father's voice as he walked him through tying the umbilical cord with thread and dabbing the stub with iodine. Now look for the afterbirth. Do you see what I mean by the afterbirth? Is it all the way out of her? Trace the umbilical cord to find out. Put it in the newspaper and roll it up and set it by the door. Don't move fast. Now go back to the pup. Pick it up. Use both hands. Remember to praise Iris when you're done. She's being very good about all this. Very gracious. Don't be scared if she grabs your hand. It just means she's not ready to let you touch her pup yet. While you're holding it, she's going to be watching you. Try not to take it out of her reach and never out of her sight. Look it over. Does it look normal? Look at its face. Is it okay? Good. Now set it down so its head is near a nipple. Good. Watch for a minute. Is it taking the nipple? Move the pup a little closer. How about now? Is it taking the nipple? Good. Iris lay with her neck flat on the bedding, eyes half shut. Breaths like sighs lifted her chest. Edgar discovered he could hear the faint suckling of the pup over the thunderous pounding in his ears. He scooted backward until he could lean against the wall. He took a long, quavering breath and looked over at his father. You forgot to praise her, his father said, his voice so quiet Edgar barely heard it. He opened his eyes again and he was smiling. But wait a while now. She wants to rest. The pups arrived about half an hour apart. When the third was nursing, Edgar's father gathered up the newspaper piles by the door and walked out of the whelping room. He came back carrying a pan of warm milk. Edgar held it while Iris lapped. Then he ran his fingers into the bowl and let her lick the last drops. And then he held her water bowl. She turned to her pups, rolling them and licking them until they cried, and then, satisfied, lowered her muzzle to the bedding. The fourth pup looked normal in every way, yet it sagged in Edgar's hand when he lifted it. His father pressed the limp shape to his ear and held his breath. He swung the pup high in the air and quickly down to the floor, listened, and did it again. Then he shook his head and laid the stillborn pup aside. Did I do something wrong? Edgar sighed. No, his father said. Sometimes a pup just isn't strong enough to survive whelping. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong, and it doesn't mean that there's any problem with the rest of the litter. But now would be a good time to walk her. She'll relax for the rest of the whelping. Edgar nodded and collected the short lead and gently slapped his thigh to coax Iris out of the whelping box. She bent her head to her pups and licked them away from her. They began to peep like chicks. She allowed Edgar to lead her into the yard. The night was cloudless, and Almondine watched them from the porch, whining quietly. Not yet, he sighed. Soon. Iris made for the top of the orchard, urinated, then pulled heavily toward the barn. As he closed the barn doors and the swath of yellow light narrowed against the wood opposite, he saw a flash of eyeshine. 2 pale green discs that vanished and appeared again. Forte, he thought. He wished he could take the time to walk out and be sure but instead he turned and led Iris to the whelping room. The pen door stood open. His father was gone, along with the stillborn pup. Iris stood over her pups, methodically licking them, then lay and nudged them into the circle of her legs. 4 more pups came that night. Edgar washed and inspected each, offering Iris water and food when he thought she would take it. His father sat against the wall, elbows propped on his knees, watching. After the 8th pup, his father palpated Iris's belly. There were probably no more, he said, but they should wait. Edgar cleaned the fur on Iris's legs and all of her back parts, and he dried her with a fresh towel. He coaxed her into the warm night once again. When they returned, Iris went directly to the whelping box and urged her pups against her teats as she had before. "She's a good mother," Edgar sighed. "She is indeed," his father said. He guided Edgar out of the whelping room. The bright kennel lights cast circles under his father's eyes, and Edgar wondered if he himself looked equally weary. "I want you to stay in the barn tonight, but keep out of her pen unless she's having problems. First, though, I want you to come back into the house and clean up." They walked into the dark kitchen together. The kitchen clock read 2:25. Almondine lay near the porch. She sauntered drowsily over and scented Edgar's legs and hands, then leaned against his knee. Edgar's mother appeared in the bedroom doorway wearing her bathrobe. "Well," she said. "3 females, 4 males," he signed. He made the sign for beautiful, a wide, sweeping gesture. "This means beautiful." Beautiful. That's in sign language. She smiled and walked around the table and hugged him. "Edgar," she murmured. He'd fixed himself a ham sandwich and told her everything. Some of it was already jumbled in his mind. He could not remember whether the stillborn puppy was the 4th or 5th. Then all at once he could think of nothing else to say. "Can I go back out now?" "Yes," she said, "go." His father stood and laid a hand on Edgar's shoulder and looked at him. After a time, Edgar felt embarrassed and looked down. "Thank you," he sighed. His father raised his fingertips to his mouth and held them there. He drew a breath and tipped his hand outward. "You're welcome." Almondine squeezed through the porch door ahead of him and plunged down the steps. There were no clouds to obscure the stars overhead or the crescent moon reclined at the horizon. "Actually, I think this is 'you're welcome,' not this. This. You're welcome." There were no clouds to obscure the stars overhead or the crescent moon reclined at the horizon. The longer he looked, the more stars he saw. No end to them. He thought of Claude and how he had been overwhelmed by the sky his first night home. "Whoosh," it said, as if a person might fall into something that large. In the barn, he stopped to collect a clean towel from the medicine room and the new Webster Encyclopedic Dictionary of the English Language from its place atop the file cabinets, and he went into the nursery. Iris lay on her side in the whelping box, breaths tidal, her pups chirping and grunting as they nursed. He would need names now, particularly good names. He stretched out along the passageway floor, using the towel for a pillow, and opened the dictionary. Almondine scented the air and peered into the pen, tail low. Iris opened her eyes and raised her head. Then Almondine stepped over Edgar and lay beside him. He pulled her onto her side, and she pawed the air and gave out a little gasp, and they looked through the pen wire together. The low barrier of the whelping box hid the puppies, but when Edgar closed his eyes, he saw them anyway, shining black crescents tucked against the down of their mother's belly. This chapter is called Essence. October. Dry leaves chattered beneath the apple trees. For 3 nights running, pearl flakes of snow materialized around Edgar and Almondine as they walked from the kennel to the house. Almondine poked her nose into the apparition of her own breath, while Edgar watched a snowflake dissolve in midair, one and then another. Those that made it to the ground quivered atop blades of grass, then wilted into ink drops. At the porch, they turned to look at their footsteps, a pair of dark trails through the lawn. The 4 of them played intricate games of canasta until late in the night. Edgar partnered with his mother. They both liked to freeze the deck. Slow things down. Let the tension rise with the height of the discard pile. Soon enough, you got an idea of which cards a player needed and when they hoarded. And which they hoarded. Sometimes a person was forced to make an impossible choice. His father scavenged the low point cards, arranging meld after meld on the table. Claude preferred to hold his cards, fanning them, rearranging them, walking them with his fingers until, without warning, He would complete 2 or 3 canastas and go out. They harassed one another as they played. "Your turn, Claude," Edgar's father said. "Hold on, I'm plotting a revolution." "Hey, no table talk." "That's not table talk. I'm trying to get my partner off my back." "Well, Edgar and I don't like it. There's no telling what sort of signals you two have cooked up." "All right, here's a discard. Take it." "Ah, does your trash never end?" "Here's one for my dear husband." His father looked at the discard and peered around his tract of melds. "Jesus, Gar, you play like a farmer." "What's wrong with that? You should thank me. It's your crop, too." "What's the score again?" 32-30 to 28-60. You're behind. That's only one naturals difference. Now that was table talk for sure. "I was just saying what's true. Every time Edgar scratches his ear, he's probably telling you all the cards in his hand. Look at that devious expression. What's it mean when he yawns? I've got jacks and I'm going out next round?" "You wish. I think we're stuck in this one to the bitter end." "You're the one who froze the pile. Come on, Edgar, what's it going to be?" "Wait," he signed, one-handed. "See there? Now, what's that mean?" "It means he can't decide what to discard." Edgar pondered, and he slapped his thigh, and Almudine sauntered over, and he held out 2 cards face down. "Could be either one of these," he signed. She scented one, then the other. "She knows the first." He placed a 10 of hearts on the discard pile. "Okay, nice. You got the dog scouting cards? Remind me to lower my cards when she's behind me. Pass the popcorn. I need to think." Claude chewed a kernel and looked across the table at Edgar's father. On the wall, the telephone buzzed quietly, the sound like a June bug on a window screen. "What was that?" Claude said. "Oh, I don't even hear that anymore. When they converted us off the party line, it half rings like that once in a while. When you pick it up again, it's just a dial tone. We call, they say it's fixed, then it buzzes again." You ever going to put a phone in the barn?" "No." "Quit stalling." Claude counted his cards. "Oh, Lord, here we go," his mother said. "Next game, I want to switch partners. My brother's running out of luck. All he knows how to do is start melds. Besides, with Edgar on my team, I get 2 for 1. "You can't have him. Edgar and I are always partners." "Another black 3. How many of those do you have?" "That's what you're going to find out. All good things come to those who wait, and I intend to make you wait. Edgar, listen to your poor old Uncle Claude. You can get anything you want in this world if you're willing to go slow enough. Remember that. Words of wisdom." "Did you just call yourself slow?" "Well, a smart kind of slow." His father discarded a queen of clubs and looked at Edgar over his glasses. "If you're the good son I raised you to be, you won't pick that up." Edgar held 2 cards, neither of them queens. He smiled and pulled a queen off the deck and flipped the new card back onto the discard pile. Claude drew off the deck and tapped the new card on the table, and then it disappeared into the mass of cards feathered out in his hand. He looked at Edgar's father. "If I'm so slow, then how could I know that that's the 6th queen in that pile? Which is why I can drop this lovely lady and break Trudy's heart." He snapped another queen onto the discards and grinned. Edgar's mother pulled out a pair of queens and laid them on the table. "Well, I'll be damned," Claude said. "We don't use that kind of language around here," she said, mocking primly, while raking the discard pile over. "It was for cause. I guess I might as well stretch my legs." She parceled out the bounty, folding up the 2 of her melds and tossing a set of cards over to Edgar. "Partner, may I go out?" she said. "Look at that. Your own wife did that." "It did seem unnecessary, didn't it?" his father said, but he was grinning. His mother looked back and forth between them. "All's fair in love and canasta," she said. Claude counted his cards. "You were holding 220 points, his father said. "Yep. Doesn't seem like it paid off, does it?" "You just play your old farmer way, and I'll be in charge of showing some style." "A fine proposition if you weren't my partner." "I'll make it up to you, brother. Haven't I always?" To this his father said nothing. He counted out cards from his melds to offset Claude's loss, then picked up the pad of paper and noted the results. The phone buzzed again, and Claude shook his head and shoveled the cards together and began to shuffle. Edgar took Almudine with him to the kennel. At 4 months old, his pups were clumsy, happy beasts with overlong legs and narrow chests. Their ears flopped over except when they looked intently at something. It had taken Edgar almost 2 weeks to select names from the dictionary, sampling and rejecting possibilities, sleeping with them held in his mind, and still, the morning after deciding, he had woken filled with regrets. Now it was as though the pups had been born with names already cast, and all he had done was thrash about until they were revealed. Babu, a Hindu title of respect paid to gentlemen, equivalent to master and sir. Babu in English was the broken English of Bengal. Essay, to exert one's power or faculties on, to make an effort, to perform, to try, to attempt, to endeavor to do, to make experiment of, an effort made for the performance of anything, a trial, attempt, or endeavor, a test or experiment, a literary composition intended to prove some particular point or illustrate a particular subject, not having the importance of a regular treatise, a short disquisition on a subject of taste, philosophy, or common life. Finch, a large family of small songbirds, including the bunting sparrow and goldfinch, having a small conical beak adapted to crackling seeds. Pout, to thrust out the lips as in sullenness, contempt, or displeasure, hence to look sullen, to swell out as the lips to be prominent. Opal, a precious stone of various colors and varieties, the finest characterized by its iridescent reflection of light, and formerly believed to possess magical virtues. Tinder, an inflammable substance generally composed of partially burned linen used for kindling fire from a spark struck with a steel and flint. Umbra, the total shadow of the earth or moon in an eclipse, or the dark cone projected from a planet or satellite on the side opposite to the sun, as contrasted with the penumbra, the dark central portion of a sunspot surrounded by a brighter annular portion. After deciding, he'd turned to each entry in the New Webster Encyclopedic Dictionary of the English Language and penciled the dog's litter number, and birth date in the margin. D1114 L171 6372. The margins were small and filled with annotations, and he had to write carefully, sideways, when the word appeared in the middle of the 3 columns of definitions. After he had finished, he'd return the dictionary to its place on the filing cabinets next to the master litter book. Babu was the largest of the litter. He could set his front paws on Edgar's shoulders and lick his face with ease. Essay, the wild one, and the leader, liked to play tricks. Tinder flung himself on any sibling he found asleep, growling them into a wrestling match. Only Opal could back him into a corner. Pout was thoughtful, sober, and cautious. Finch, a study in earnest impulsiveness. Umbra, black from head to toe, was a watcher, a retreater to corners. They were all ferociously undisciplined and forgetful, but good-natured too, and sweet to look at, and, for short periods, at least, they reveled in the training. The barn roof had long been completed, and another litter whelped and named. As part of his work as the medicine man of the kennel, as Trudy started calling him, Claude took the newest litter of pups under his care. Edgar's father used the extra time to place yearlings and plan litters, spending days on the telephone and writing letters and poring over records. But no sooner did this arrangement seem comfortable than arguments between his father and Claude began to erupt. "I'm not some dang stray you lured in." Sorry, there was a really bad word in there, so I substituted. "You know me, I'd shoot you if..." "Of course not," Edgar's father replied. "You know me, I'd shoot you if I were you." I would shoot you if you were." When things were easiest between them, it was his mother's doing. She mocked their arguments laughingly, or interposed herself and flirted. When a discussion threatened to slide from fervent to angry, she'd lay a hand on Edgar's father's wrist, and he'd look at her, startled, as if he had just remembered something. Then days of amicable banter, visits from Dr. Papineau, evenings watching television. But Edgar knew the moment he walked in the door when there had been another incident. He'd find his father at the kitchen table, shoulders hunched, glowering at his paperwork. If one of them walked into a room, the other found a reason to leave, and Edgar's mother would sigh in exasperation. And yet 2 mornings later, they'd be talking again at breakfast, and that would be that. One morning, his father announced that they'd better collect firewood before they get a snow that's stuck. This was work they did each fall. Cutting the aspen and birch cordwood that stacked in the spring alongside the old logging road that cut through their woods. "Can I drive?" Edgar asked. He meant Alice, their old orange Alice Chalmers seed tractor, with its curved fenders and half-moon drawbar. In place of a bucket seat, Alice had a flat, padded bench upon which 2 could ride, though the passenger had to put his arm around the driver and hold one of the uprights. Over the years, Edgar had graduated from running the throttle to steering, with his father's hand resting on the wheel, to shifting, and lately to clutching and braking. He met his father behind the barn, and they walked to Alice together. Edgar settled himself behind the wheel, and his father took the crank to the front and slotted it into the hole beneath the radiator grill and hauled the crank over. There was a muffled pop from inside the engine, and a belch of sooty smoke escaped the stack. But afterward the engine sat inert. He tried again. Then he walked to the milk house and returned with a can of starter fluid in his hand, and he tipped up a hinge plate inside Alice's carburetor and emptied a long spray into its gullet. He walked to the front of the tractor again, touched the bill of his cap and rubbed his hands together and hauled the crank over. There was a gunshot sound and the handle bucked wildly backward. "Oh," he said, "we got her attention now. Give it another notch." Edgar nodded and ratcheted up the throttle level. This time Alice gave out a roar, and from her stack poured a black cloud of exhaust. The day was warm. A gray cloud ceiling stretched from horizon to horizon, and the light coming through cast no shadows on the ground. Edgar backed the tractor up to the ancient iron-wheeled wagon parked on the edge of the south field. His father swung the yoke into place and dropped the hitch pin through and slid onto the seat beside him. They chugged around to the front of the barn where Claude set the chainsaw and gasoline in the wagon and stepped onto the yoke. "Ha!" he shouted, and they set off. At the bottom of the slope behind the barn, his father reached over and goosed the throttle lever 3 notches. Edgar gulped and gripped the steering wheel, and they shot past the woodchucks in the rock pile, all standing in a line, hands prayerful against fat bellies. His father tipped his hat to each animal in turn, shouting, "Ma'am, ma'am, ladies." Then Claude, snagging a passing clod of dirt, pitched it overhead, sending the matrons scampering into the rocky crevices. They crossed the field. 2 tremendous birches marked the entrance to the logging road at the edge of the woods. Their leaves blanketed the ground below with brown and yellow, and their white trunks were decorated with speckled curls of paper. Edgar throttled back, ready to turn the driving over to his father, but his father motioned Edgar ahead. Claude hung out from behind the seat and looked up the trail. When he saw what was coming, he hopped off the yoke and walked alongside. Edgar notched the throttle down and guided Alice through the pools of frost-brown fern cascading over the path. He jackknifed the wagon, trying to back it up to the first 8-foot cordwood stack. Then he killed the engine, trying to straighten it out. "You do it," Edgar signed. "Try again," his father said, and he walked to Alice's front end and cranked it back to life. Edgar ground the shift lever into reverse and sweated and listened to his father and uncle as they shouted instructions. "Left, go left, and it'll straighten out." "Not left, right." "His left, not mine." "Far enough. Whoa, whoa, whoa there." "Okay, a little more. Stop. Little more. Stop." "Good." Edgar flipped the toggle to kill the engine and hopped down. Claude reached into the wagon and pulled out the chainsaw and the red gasoline can. They began to work their way through the pile. Their work was monotonous but pleasant. Edgar heaved a log out, and Claude sawed off a fireplace-sized chunk, and Edgar heaved the log again. Sawdust sweetened the air. Edgar daydreamed and looked around and wondered if Schultz had ever cut wood in that part of the forest, and what part of the house or barn might be built from it. Whenever the cut wood piled up, Claude stood with the saw idling while Edgar and his father tossed the chunks into the wagon. Halfway through the first pile, light rain began to fall, hardly more than a trickle on the back of their necks. When it didn't let up, his father shouted to Claude. Claude glanced over and returned to cutting while Edgar advanced the log. When he stopped again, the air was filled with a fine, cool mist cut by drops of condensation falling from the skyward branches. "Let's load and head back," Edgar's father said, and he began to loft cut pieces into the wagon, making it rattle and boom. Edgar and Claude joined him, but when they had finished, Claude looked up through the treetops and wiped his face with his shirt sleeves. "It's letting up," he said. "We don't need to stop." And all at once, the lightheartedness that had made them joke and wave at the woodchucks vanished. His father's jaw was set. When he spoke next, it was as though some argument had already taken place, with positions staked out and a deadlock reached, all in some sphere invisible to Edgar. "The wood is wet and slippery," his father says. "So is that saw. We can come back tomorrow when it's dry. We won't have to worry about anybody getting hurt." For a moment, the three of them gazed at the stacked cordwood, shiny with moisture. Claude shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said, and he braced the chainsaw against a log and yanked the rope starter. The engine sputtered for a moment and caught. His father shouted something at Claude, who mouthed, "What?" and revved the chainsaw until it was impossible to hear his father's reply. Then he shouted, "What?" again. When his father took the bait, Claude squeezed the throttle until the chainsaw howled in his hands. His father paled with anger. A grin spread across Claude's face, and he turned and dropped the chain bar into a log, and a wake of wet wood chips sprayed onto the ground. His father stalked over to Edgar and cupped his mouth by his ear. "Get up on the tractor." Edgar clambered into the tractor seat and flipped the ignition switch. His father cranked the starter, swung up on the driver's side of the seat, gunned the engine, and they bounced their way out of the woods, logs rattling and flying off the back of the wagon. At the house, they stacked the wood in the inside corner by the porch while the whine of the chainsaw pierced the drizzle, reduced by distant to an insect sound. When they finished, Edgar parked Alice beside the barn. Almondine greeted him at the door and chaperoned him up the stairs. He listened to his mother and father talk while he changed out of his wet clothes. "So what if he wants to cut wood in the rain?" she said. "Let him. And if he drives the chainsaw into his leg, what then? And if the saw rusts up over the winter from getting wet?" "Gar, you're right, but you can't ride him like that. He's a grown man." "That's just it. He's not a grown man. He's got no more sense than he had 20 years ago. He's got things into his head, and whatever I say, he'll do the opposite." "He's a grown man," his mother repeated. "You can't make decisions for him. You couldn't back then, and you can't now." Footsteps and the click of the coffee pot lid. When Edgar and Almondine walked into the kitchen, Edgar's mother was standing beside his father and with her arms crossed around his neck. His father sipped his coffee and handed the cup up to his mother and looked out the window toward the woods. "You didn't see him down there gunning the saw whenever I tried to explain to him. It was childish," he said. "It was dangerous." Edgar's mother did not respond. She rubbed his father's shoulders and said they needed some things from the store. By the time they returned, Claude had carried everything up from the woods, cleaned and oiled the saw, and lay asleep in his room. A week before Thanksgiving, Claude took the truck into town. When he returned late that night, even the cold gust of wind that followed him inside couldn't disguise the smell of cigarette smoke and beer. He dumped a bag of groceries on the table and looked at Edgar's father. "Oh dear, His Eminence is much displeased." He trudged drunkenly into the living room, then turned back. "Look on his works, ye mighty in despair," he cried in a booming voice, arms outswept, bowing until he nearly tipped over. When the days were warm, Edgar strayed away from the house, scurrying into the woods with Almondine for puffball mushrooms and arrowheads, looking as well for signs of Forte, who hadn't appeared since late September. One day they would find his bones, he thought sadly. They walked to the Whale Rock and sat on the edge of the peninsula of woods and watched smoke curl out of the chimney. Almondine fell into a half-sleep. Brown leaves drifted down from the trees, and her pelt twitched when they landed on her. After dinner, he snuck out to practice stays with Tinder, who wanted more than anything to jump up and run. He bolted the barn doors from the inside and let the pups run loose up and down the kennel aisles while he sat on a straw bale. Babu sat with him. As they started looking for trouble at once, they rolled on their backs and paw-boxed at Almondine, who examined and dismissed them. He fetched 6 tennis balls from the workshop and threw them against the doors until the aisle was a mass of surging, raucous animals, and when they tired, he led them into the mow and read to them, signing under the yellow nova of the bulbs in the rafters. Edgar first heard of Star Child Colony that fall and of Alexander Honeywell, whose long, straight hair was indeed the color of honey. The television news carried the stories of the commune located at the Canadian side of Lake Superior near Thunder Bay. Reporters stood beside Alexandra Honeywell on the outskirts of a woody glade, a house framed out behind them, the autumn leaves brilliant yellow. Sometimes she answered the reporter's question directly, and other times she looked into the television and exhorted people to come and help. This is a place for peace. Come to Star Child. We need people with skills, people who want to work. We don't care if you're a student, a musician, or a soldier. Leave it behind. We need strong hands and brave hearts. Alexandra Honeywell was beautiful. Edgar knew this was why she showed up on television so often. If he was in his room and overheard a news teaser about Star Child, he'd come downstairs and sit in the living room and gaze at her while his parents exchanged glances. Claude let out a low whistle at the sight of her. Thanksgiving came and passed. Edgar woke one night to a sound like a gunshot, though even as he threw up his blankets, he understood it was the porch door slamming back against the house. Almondine scrambled up from her place by the door, and together they looked out the window. The porch light was shining, the ground was thinly covered in snow, and the wind blew hoary gray flakes across the glass. At the base of the porch steps he saw his father and Claude. Their arms were crooked around each other's necks like wrestlers. Shadows cast black and elongate toward the field. Claude had hold of his father's closed fist, as if trying to force it open, and they grunted and pushed wordlessly against each other, counterbalanced and shaking with effort as snow settled on their shoulders and hair. The clench broke and they stepped apart, breath gray in the cold air. Edgar's father raised a hand and pointed at Claude. But before he could speak, Claude charged, pulling them both to the ground. Edgar's father's glasses glittered in the air. He brought his hands down on Claude's back and hard on the side of his head. Claude's grip loosened. Edgar's father climbed to his feet. Claude scrambled up after him, but he slipped and fell heavily down. And before he could get up, Edgar's father was there, foot drawn back. Claude curled his arms over his face convulsively, and a shriek filled the yard. For a time, the two men were perfectly still, and the falling snow itself froze in the air. Then Edgar's father drew a breath. He set his foot down with a disdainful gesture. He tossed what he'd held into the snow, the keys to the truck. Then he turned and walked into the house, and the porch light flickered off. Edgar and Almondine panted in unison, their breaths congealing on the window. Almondine had been growling low in her chest, her hackles had been growing low in her chest, but Edgar only heard it now, and he reached over and smoothed her hackles. He wiped a watery path across the fog glass. Claude clambered to his feet and stooped to pick up the truck keys. The feeble cab light glowed briefly over him as he opened the truck door and pulled himself inside and slammed the door shut. The starter grumbled, the tail lights flared as if he were stomping on the brake. The truck sat wreathed in clouds of exhaust. Finally, it rolled toward the barn and backed around. The headlights swept the yard where Edgar's father and Claude had fought, their struggle drawn in snow that glowed white, then red, then darkened again as the truck roared past the house and away down Town Line Road. A thin sigh. He knelt by the window and let the images replay themselves. The snow lay jaundiced under the yard light, and the shadow of the house lamp flacked across the snow, unbroken save for a single skewed rectangle glowing at its core. Light from the kitchen window. Flakes of snow were captured there, drifting upward like ash. Up through the furnace register his father's voice rang, tinny and fractured. Edgar walked to his bed and slapped the mattress for Almondine, but she lay in the doorway and would not come. At last he dragged his blanket over to her and arranged himself on the slatted floor. She rolled onto her side and braced her feet straight-legged against him. Then all the voices fell silent. The light at the bottom of the stairs dimmed. They lay together on the dusty, smelling floor, listening to the timbers of the house groan and pop. Formless light seethed when Edgar closed his eyes. Then he was awake. He put his hands under Almondine's belly, and she stood and stretched her feet out front and bowed her spine until a high whine escaped her, and they crept down the stairs, feeling their way in the dark. In the living room, the tiny candlestick lamp cast just enough light to outline the chairs. He thought the kitchen would be a shambles, but the table stood level, the chairs snugged evenly beneath. all shadow and silhouette. He walked around the table and touched the chairs in turn, points of the compass. The freezer compressor ticked and engaged and murmured a low electric throb. The blower sighed warm air across his stockinged foot as he passed the register. A silver bead of water blossomed at the threaded end of the tap and fell into the void. He twisted down the faucets. His mother whispered to him from the doorway of their bedroom, "Edgar, what are you looking for?" He turned and signed, but in the dark she couldn't read it. He walked to the living room and stood near the candlestick lamp, and she followed behind, cinching up the belt around her robe. She sat on the edge of her chair and looked at him. Almondine stood beside her until his mother ran her hand along the dog's flanks. Then she downed between them on the floor. Their shadows moved enormous across the walls and windows of the living room as they signed. "Is he all right?" His lip is cut. He lost his glasses. He feels ashamed. "What happened?" She thought for a moment, then started again. "It's hard to say." "Is he coming back?" She shook her head. "Of course not. Not after this." "What about the truck?" "I don't know." Edgar stood and gestured at the door. "I saw where his glasses fell. I was going to go get them." "Will you still know in the morning?" "I think so." "Then wait until tomorrow. He'll wake if he hears the door." "Okay." Edgar stood and walked to the stairway. "Edgar," his mother whispered. He looked back at her. "This thing between your father and Claude, it's old, from since they were children. I don't think they even understand it. I know I don't. The thing to remember is that it's over. We tried to help Claude, and it didn't work out. We tried." Edgar nodded. "And Edgar?" He turned to look back at her. "What?" "I don't think your father's going to want to answer a lot of questions about what happened." She smiled a little, and that made him smile. He felt some unnameable tenderness toward his father, talking about him in the dark like that. A laugh came up from inside him, like a hiccup. He nodded and clapped his leg, and he and Almondine mounted the steps, the top floor solely theirs once more. And that night he dreamt of a jumbled world, color and sound without substance, and in the dreaming everything fitted together perfectly, mosaic pieces interlocked in a stately, exquisite dance. Dr. Papineau drove their truck back out to their house the next day. Edgar's father packed Claude's things in the truck, not much more than the suitcase that he had arrived with, a box of magazines, his shirts and pants, a pair of work boots, and a well-worn navy pea coat. In time, they heard that Claude had picked up part-time work at the veneer mill and odd jobs on the side. He worked for Dr. Papineau. In fact, later on they put the rollaway bed in the truck, along with the little table and the lamp, and drove them into town too. The snow held off until December that year, but once loosed, it seemed never to stop. Edgar and his father shoveled the driveway while flanks covered their caps. Edgar's father knew the trick of skimming the snow without picking up gravel. "Leave some on the driveway, would ya?" he'd say, reminding Edgar how the stones in the grass shot like bullets across the lawn on the first mowing. Edgar took his litter into the snow in pairs or trios, Tinder and Essay and Finch, then Pout and Baboo, then Umbra and Opal. They chased one another, sliding on their front paws, reversing, backpedaling, running with their noses against the ground, trenching pale lines in the powder, stopping only to sneeze it out. Those early snows didn't pack, and when Edgar managed to squeeze together a snowball, he tossed it at Tinder. It disintegrated in the dog's mouth, and he licked his chops and looked on the ground for it. The Saturday before Christmas, they planned to go shopping in Ashland, but it was snowing so hard his mother thought they wouldn't be able to get back. They stayed home and watched the astronauts driving around on the moon in their buggy. His father said it looked like they were getting ready to plant corn. And every week there was a news story about Alexandra Honeywell and Star Child Colony. It was cold. People were leaving, she admitted, but the inspired would take their place. She stood in the snow reading poetry to the camera and talked about the Voyagers. Often, those segments played after the weather report. He never failed to be in the living room when the forecast was announced. On New Year's Eve, his mother roasted a duck. Near midnight, they poured 3 glasses of champagne and clinked. The television counted down to midnight, and when Auld Lang Syne began to play, His mother jumped up and held out her hand and asked him to dance. "I don't know how," he signed. "Then it's time you learned," she said, pulling him up off the couch. Though they were staying home, she wore a black and white dress and black shoes with straps across the back and nylons. She showed him how to put her arm around her waist and hold out his other hand, and she put her hand in his. "This is how the girls will look at you when you dance with them," she said, and she looked into his eyes until he blushed. He didn't know how to move his feet. He couldn't even explain the problem since she was holding his hands, but she knew anyway. "Here, like a box," she said. She stopped and made him put his hands out, palm down, and she moved them to demonstrate what his feet should do. Then she stepped up to him again. The room was dark, and the lights from the Christmas tree sparkled in the windows. When she put her head against his shoulder, the air grew warm. The sweet cider taste of the champagne was in his mouth, mingled with his mother's perfume, and he knew even then that the sensation would be with him for the rest of his life. When the song stopped, his mother whispered, "Happy New Year." His father had been leaning against the kitchen doorway, and when the orchestra started in again, he walked up and said, "Pardon me, may I cut in?" His mother slipped away from Edgar and into his father's arms. Edgar watched them dance, music ringing through the house, and then he opened the refrigerator and took a package of curd and pulled on his shoes and coat. He tried to tell them where he was going, though the song had ended, and they stood there swaying, silhouetted against the lights of the Christmas tree. He and Almondine ran through a night black and sharp edged with cold. In the barn, he switched on the lights and set Patty Page singing the Tennessee Waltz on the old record player. Then he used up the curds, handing them out to the dogs, even the puppies, and signing to each in turn a Happy New Year. January thaw, the ash they spread along the driveway melted the snow into gray puddles, candied with ice in the morning. He sat in their living room wearing a coat and boots, watching for the yellow caterpillar of the school bus through the bare trees. In the afternoon, the sun was up barely long enough to take his litter into the yard before supper time, to proof them on comforts and stays in the snow. They learned quickly now. He led 3 of them at a time to the birches in the south fields, then ran to the yard and released them with a sweeping gesture they could see against the sky, and they sliced across the field like a trio of wolves, bodies stretched over the white snowdrifts. He was getting better, too. With a single dog, he could make leash corrections as well as his mother, catching them in the middle of their first steps out of stay, when they had barely made up their mind to break. When he did it right, they settled back before lifting their hindquarters all the way off the ground. But he didn't make it look easy like she did. It took every bit of concentration. He learned to toss a collared chain at their hindquarters if they didn't come on the long line recalls, though his accuracy had a problem. Plus, he moved his arm so much they saw it coming. He practiced against a bale of straw. His mother could flick her wrist and catch a dog loafing halfway across the mow. When he wasn't expecting it, she threw one against his own backside. The shock of it, the jingle and the impact made him jump. "Like that?" she said, smiling. "Works pretty well, doesn't it?" And all the while, his dogs grew smarter, caught on to the corrections, and found ways to beat them. They would be 7 months old soon, and their coats were sleek and winter thickened. They'd grown as tall as they were going to get, but his father said their chests wouldn't fill out until the summer. Dr. Papineau, when he visited, could never keep them straight, but to Edgar they were so different, it was hard to believe they came from the same litter. He could tell them apart by their movements alone, the sound of their footfalls. Essay always pushed to see what she could get away with, waiting until he looked away to bolt. Tinder, the most rambunctious, would break a stay just because one of his littermates looked at him with a certain glint in his eye. Babu was the opposite. Once in a stay, he would sit forever. He made up for his delay coming off the long line with his love of retrieves. He trotted back to Edgar again and again with the target in his mouth, and aw shucks swagger rocking his hindquarters. They were, each of them, brilliant, frustrating, stubborn, petulant, and Edgar could watch them move, just move, all day. Icy grains, dry and white, were falling from low flanneled clouds. The wind gathered and swept the grains across the yard like a surf. When Edgar opened the barn door, a tendril of snow scorpioned along the cement floor and dispersed at Almondine's feet. His father was kneeling in the farthest whelping pen, where a pup squirmed and mewled on the silver pan of the scale. There's our timer. Let's finish this chapter. its ears folded and otter-like, as Edgar watched his father cradle the pup in his hands and set it back with its mother. "Giants," he said, writing a note on the log sheet, "and ornery. They haven't opened their eyes yet, and they're already pushing each other around. You should be grateful you didn't end up with this batch." "I'm taking mine upstairs," Edgar signed. His father nodded and turned back to the pup. "I want to clean out those buckets in the workshop before your mother gets back from town. When you finish, find me, okay?" "Okay," he signed. He knew which buckets his father meant, a whole row of them under the workshop stairs, all different sizes, some not buckets at all, but battered old lidless 10-gallon milk cans, filled to the brim with scrap metal, old nails, hinges, screws, bolts. His father had been threatening to either sort through them or pitch them into the silo for as long as he could remember. Edgar pulled Finch and Essie out of their runs to practice long-distance downs. The dogs bounded to the workshop and up the stairs, tussling and growling in the straw as he and Almudine followed in the mow. He could see his breath in the air. He closed the vestibule door. Almudine, without immediate training duties, found a comfortable corner to watch from. Edgar stayed one dog and let it rest while he snapped a long line to the other's collar and put it in a standing stay. On each trial, he lifted his hand overhead to signal a down, rewarding them with the scrub of their ruff, or correcting with a sharp tug on the long line, which he had threaded through an eye bolt to the floor to direct the force down and not forward. As soon as they'd mastered one distance, he retreated a pace farther. Essie understood this exercise at once and how to confound it. She waited until Edgar was walking toward her, when it was hardest to give a correction, then stood up before she was released, panting merrily. Or she would lie down but immediately roll over. Twice, while she was supposed to be waiting her turn, he discovered her poking at the bales of straw, contemplating a climb. Finch, on the other hand, never took his eyes off Edgar. The problem was he just kept standing there, watching, when Edgar signed the down. After Edgar had repeated the command 3 times, Finch began to look concerned. Edgar scolded himself for repeating commands and walked over, but the sight of Edgar approaching struck Finch like a bolt of inspiration, and the dog slid to the floor. For a break, Edgar flung tennis balls and whirled coffee can lids into the farthest corners of the mow for the dogs to chase. The pounding of their feet on the mow floor provoked the kennel dogs below into a chorus of muffled barks. He started the 2 of them holding retrieval targets, just taking them in their mouths for a second or two, when he noticed that the kennel dogs were still barking. Odd, since both his dogs were now sitting quietly. Edgar opened the wet vestibule door and listened, then started down the stairs. Finch and Essie, nails clicking on the wooden treads, crowded past him. "Gotta work on that," he thought. He was almost to the bottom tread before he saw his father sprawled and motionless on the floor near the workshop entrance. He was wearing his winter coat as if heading outside, and he lay face down. For a moment, Edgar stood paralyzed. Then he bolted down the steps and was on his knees beside his father while Essie and Finch stomped and plunged around them. He shook his father and dug his fingers into the heavy fabric of his coat and rolled him onto his back and peered into his face. "What happened? What happened?" Behind the lenses of his glasses, his father blinked. How slowly his eyes tracked Edgar's hands. He strained to lift his head, raising it no more than an inch off the floor. He stopped and took a breath. Edgar slipped his hand beneath his father's head before it could fall back against the cement. And then he was frantic. He withdrew his hand as gently as he could and checked his fingers for blood. But there was none. He tore his sweater off and bunched it up beneath his father's head. His father's mouth had fallen open. "Can you see me?" he signed. He yanked down the zipper of his father's coat and looked at his checkered work shirt beneath. He patted him from throat to belt. No blood, no injury. "What happened? Did you fall? Can you see me?" His father didn't answer back, nor was he looking back. Then Edgar was running through the cold, the house jerking in his vision. Wisps of snow coiled around the porch steps. He burst into the kitchen and yanked the phone off its hook. He stood for a moment, unsure of what to do. He pulled the 0 around on the dial and waited. Almudine was in the kitchen with him, and he couldn't remember her running alongside to the house or even following him down from the mow. After the second ring, a woman's voice came on the line. "Operator." He was trying already to make the words. He moved his lips. A sigh came out of him, thin and dry. "This is the operator. How may I help you?" His heart surged in his chest. He tried to force sound from his mouth, but there was only the gasp of exhaled breath. He swung his hand wide and then struck his chest with all the force he could muster, mouthing the words. "Is this an emergency? the operator said. Again he struck his chest. Again. Each blow drove a single note from his body. Anna! Can you tell me where you are? The operator said. Almondine retreated a step and began a deep, throaty barking, smashing her tail from side to side and dashing toward the door and back. I can't understand you. Can you tell me where you are? He stood, panting. He beat the receiver against the countertop until it was in fragments and left it hanging and ran out the door and up the driveway and onto the road, hoping to see his mother arriving in their truck or a passing car, any car. Almondine was beside him now. The woods were lost in the falling snow, the apple trees blanched. Beyond 100 yards, everything faded into a featureless blank so white it hurt to stare into it. A car would not be passing in such a storm. When he looked back at the barn, Essay and Finch were crossing the yard toward them. The four of them stood while he looked up and back along the road. Then he ran to the house again. A voice was coming out of the shattered handset. Need to stay where you are. I am... The dog pranced in his path, and he crossed to the barn. He had left the door open, and all the time cold air had been pouring in. He flung the door shut and threw the latch and knelt beside his father. Are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay? His father wouldn't look at him. He ran to the medicine room at the back of the barn and tore his hands across the shelves. Gauze and pills scattered around his feet as he pawed through the supplies. He returned empty-handed. Just keep him warm, he thought. He pulled a spare coat off the hook inside the workshop and draped it across his father's chest. A rack of shivers came over Edgar. Almondine walked up and put her nose to her father's cheek. Her hind legs shook as if scenting something fearful and strange. The sight made Edgar angry, and he got his legs beneath him and flew at her. She bolted to the far end of the barn and watched as he staggered back to the workshop. He knelt and looked into his father's face. He pressed his hands against his chest. He thought he would feel breath being drawn, but instead there was a single long exhalation. Through his father's open mouth came a groan, expressionless and mechanical in a falling note. And after that, nothing at all. No movement, no insuck of breath, no twitch of an eyelid. Just the collapse, like a wax figure melting. He ran down the line of pens, beating on the wire. The dogs stood on their hind legs and wailed and bayed, the roar of them like an anthem. Yet through it all he heard the whisper of snow seeping beneath the doors, seething along the floor toward his father lying there on the concrete, motionless, looking nowhere and breathing nothing. The floor jolted as if something had struck the earth. Edgar realized he was sitting. He pulled himself upright, square by square, along the wire of a pen door. Then he was beside his father again, and the dogs were quiet. Almondine crept over and nosed his hand and sat beside him. The others stayed hidden at the far end of the kennel, panting and watching. And so they waited. We're going to end there. Oh my goodness, I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine how would you get your message across. I think the sound of Almondine barking maybe was a clue. We'll find out in part 5 of the story of Edgar Sawtelle.